Just for the record, it's Ladies' Night, and our special guest tonight is Emma Moser, and
don't do the clap.
You're doing a presentation on knitting. What is it? What are you doing?
Knitting. Flannery OConnor.
Flannery O-Knitter.
So to start off, I'm going to let Flannery OConnor have the first word tonight, and this is actually the only clip that I could find of her online. And it's not even like a video clip, it's just an audio clip of her reading the beginning of one of her most famous stories called A Good Man is Hard to Find. And I thought, it might be give you a good sense of who she was and sort of her attitude.
The name of this is A Good Man is Hard to Find. The grandmother didn't want to go to Florida. She wanted to visit some of her connections in East Tennessee, and she was seizing at every chance to change Bailey's mind. Bailey was the son she lived with, her only boy. He was sitting on the edge of his chair at the table, bent over the orange sports section of the journal. "Now look here, Bailey," she said. "See here, read this." And she stood with one hand on her thin hip and the other rattling the newspaper at his bald head. "Here, this fellow that calls himself the Misfit is loose from the federal pen and headed toward Florida. And you read here what it says he did to these people. Just you read it. I wouldn't take my children in any direction with a criminal like that loose in it. I couldn't answer to my conscience if I did." Bailey didn't look up from his reading, so she wheeled around then toward the children's mother, a young woman in slacks, whose face was as broad and innocent as a cabbage, and was tied around with a green head kerchief that had 2 points on top, like rabbit's ears. She was sitting on the sofa feeding the baby his apricots out of a jar. "The children have been to Florida before," the old lady said. "You all ought to take them somewhere else for a change so they would see different parts of the world and be broad. They never have been to East Tennessee." The children's mother didn't seem to hear her, but the 8-year-old boy, John Wesley, a stocky child with glasses, said, "If you don't want to go to Florida, why don't you stay at home?" He and the little girl, June Starr, were reading the funny papers on the floor. "She wouldn't stay at home to be queen for a day," June Starr said, without raising her yellow head. "Yes, and what would you do if this fellow, the Misfit, caught you?" the grandmother asked. "I'd smack his face," John Wesley said. "She wouldn't stay at home for $1,000,000, June Starr said, afraid she'd miss something. "She has to go everywhere we go." "All right, miss," the grandmother said. "Just remember that the next time you want me to curl your hair." June Starr said her hair was naturally curly.
So I'm just curious for a show of hands, how many people here have read Flannery OConnor? Awesome. Oh, yay. Quite a good number. But for those of you who are not familiar with her, she was a fiction writer in the mid-20th century, and a Roman Catholic born and raised in Georgia. And she died at a relatively young age from lupus. She was only 39 at the time of her death. But in her lifetime, she managed to write a large number of short stories and 2 novels, I think it was just 2, as well as a number of essays, along with giving lectures at local workshops and colleges. And in the literary world, O'Connor is pretty influential, not only as an American woman author, but also as a Southern one. And her work is often labeled in a genre of writing known as the Southern Gothic. And the Southern Gothic refers to kind of very darkly humorous, mostly disturbing stories from the early 20th century that explored the strange, the often strange social complexities of Southern life.
So it's like the Southern version of Tim Burton or something?
Pretty much. Southern Tim Burton.
Southern Catholic version. A lot of modifiers.
Because O'Connor lived in the South, she was obviously surrounded by the mainly Protestant culture down there. So the Protestant South was primarily what she wrote about in her fiction. I think there's only, as far as I know, like only a couple of Catholic characters that appear in her books. I'm just reading one story now that has a priest character, but usually if there are religious characters in her stories, they're almost always Protestants. However, as I said, O'Connor was a devout Roman Catholic, and her faith had a tremendous influence on her work, so that all throughout her stories, you can find Catholic themes, usually on the topics of like sin, redemption, self-examination. But it's her nonfiction work that I think lays out her philosophy as a Catholic writer a little more explicitly. And a lot of this work appeared as essays or lectures, brown book. Most of them were gathered after her death and compiled into a couple different books, but one of them being this one, Mystery Manners. As you can see, was very well loved with all the tabs. So for our purposes, I thought it might be a good idea to start off by actually doing an overview of this book, so that we can see her philosophy as far as what it means to be a Catholic novelist. And then later we can look at how she applies that philosophy to her own fiction. So part 2, I call this O'Connor's Philosophy of Writing, aka Why So Much Christian Entertainment is So Painfully Bad.
Thank you.
This is true.
It's not entertainment.
One of the things that I love about O'Connor is that, she's not only Catholic, but she's also an excellent writer who knows what good writing looks like. And I thought it would be appropriate to read an excerpt from here that kind of beautifully summarizes her views on the challenges of being a Catholic writer. And this is the beginning of a chapter called Catholic Novelists and Their Readers. Whenever I think of the Catholic novelist and his problems, I always remember the legend of St. Francis and the Wolf of Gubbio.
And the what?
Wolf of Gubbio. Sorry. This legend has it that St. Francis converted a wolf. I don't know whether he actually converted this wolf, or whether the wolf's character didn't just greatly improve after he met St. Francis. Anyway, he calmed down a good deal. But the moral of this story, for me at least, is that the wolf, in spite of his improved character, always remained a wolf. So it is, or so it ought to be, with a Catholic, or let us just say with a thoroughly Christianized novelist. No matter how much his character may be improved by the Church, if he is a novelist, he has to remain true to his nature as one. The Church should make the novelist a better novelist. I say should, because unfortunately, this doesn't always happen. The Catholic novelist frequently becomes so entranced with his Christian state that he forgets his nature as a fiction writer. This is all right. This is fine, if he stops writing fiction. But most of the time, he doesn't stop writing it. And he makes the same kind of spectacle of himself that the wolf would have made if, after meeting with St. Francis, he had started walking on his hind legs. So as you can see, she has no qualms about criticizing other so-called Christian writers who will often sacrifice basic talent for the sake of conveying a Christian message. And in this book, she identifies some of the most common mistakes that well-intentioned Catholic writers can make. And the first problem being utilitarianism. So this is when a Christian writer sees literature, or when a Christian artist sees art as merely a means to an end. They think it only has value if, in the religious world, if it's being used to evangelize or to promote religious values. And O'Connor points out that this type of thinking ignores St. Thomas Aquinas' view, actually, on art, which is that art is a good on its own. All beauty and all aesthetically pleasing things belong to God. So literature doesn't require an insertion of religious topics to make it valuable. And the second problem with many Christian writers is that in their attempts to promote virtue, they tend to ignore the presence of sin, or at least they underportray it. My impression, just thinking on like some of the really corny Christian movies that I've seen, is that if sin is addressed at all, it's usually used only as a means to that sort of corny, unrealistic conversion at the end of the story. But for the most part, Christian writers don't like to dwell too much in examining man's sinfulness, probably because they think that it's dangerous or might lead the writer or the reader into sin. And O'Connor's response to this is twofold. First, she says that's just dishonest writing. She believes that the writer is meant to portray truthfully what he sees in the world. And if he's looking honestly at human nature, he's going to see a lot of unpleasant things. But that's part of the job of being a writer, she says. She says, fiction is about everything human, and we are made out of dust. And if you scorn getting yourself dusty, then you shouldn't try to write fiction. And then her second response to this problem is that if the writer is a Catholic and he's firm in his faith, he should trust in what she calls the security of his faith, which allows him to look at sin without necessarily being harmed. And as far as the reader goes, she has this funny line where she says, what leads the writer to his salvation may lead the reader into sin. So in other words, I think she considers that as a sort of occupational hazard, that the writer can't necessarily control whether the reader will use a depiction of sin as a warning or a justification, but this shouldn't be his concern so much as just keeping to the duties of his art. And the third problem is sentimentalism. And basically this refers to that stereotypical fluffy bunny Jesus, easy conversion, preaching to the choir sap that we see in so much Christian entertainment.
Is that what that picture is?
Yes, the little fluffy.
Why didn't you have the picture of Jesus playing baseball?
Oh, I didn't even think of that.
That's one for the ages.
I hate those. And O'Connor sees sentimentalism as a separation between the spiritual and the natural, actually. So, similar to how ignoring sin disregards our natural state, she says that sentimentalism overemphasizes the spiritual state, or at least the innocent part of the spiritual state. She has a quote here. She says, by separating nature and grace as much as possible, the writer has reduced his conception of the supernatural to pious cliché, and has become able to recognize nature in literature in only two forms, the sentimental and the obscene. He would seem to prefer the former, while being more of an authority on the latter, but the similarity between the two generally escapes him. Very Chestertonian. And then she goes on to say that with sentimentalism, there comes sort of an overemphasis on innocence, and she calls this a mock innocence of heaven, because the storylines in a lot of Christian writing tends to go straight from sin to the loftiness of heaven, while completely skipping over the very important step of redemption, which we as human beings are called to struggle our way through in this natural world. So now that we've seen what O'Connor considers bad Catholic writing, let's take a look at the qualifications she considers necessary to be a good Catholic writer. And the most important one is just being a good writer, striving for artistic excellence and actually having talent. O'Connor strongly believed that to be a writer was a vocation, and that following one's vocation means being faithful to one's duties in that vocation. And the basic duties of a writer are to stay true to his craft and to use basic strategies and techniques of writing a good story. Oh, and that's a self-portrait of Flannery OConnor, by the way, if you're wondering.
Looks kind of like a pheasant.
Who's that?
I just got that, but I couldn't see the pheasant. Kenny's head was just like there, so I had to lean in. I saw the pheasant. It's like, what are you talking about?
Another important aspect of the writer's vocation is his role as an observer. So, as mentioned earlier, the writer is called to look boldly into the universe and and into the human condition, and to try to portray them honestly. So it's kind of this phrase, write what you see. And a lot of times that means looking evil in the face too, and being honest about man's fallen state and the real presence of evil in the world. So in other words, having faith doesn't mean we should be only looking at or writing about theological things. It means we should observe everything. That our faith is the illuminator by which we see and comprehend the universe. She says, your beliefs will be the light by which you see, but they will not be what you see, and they will not be a substitute for seeing. Mystery and Manners, the title of this book, is a very important concept in her writing. So according to Flannery OConnor, one of the most important jobs of being a Catholic writer is observing the interaction between the spiritual and the natural world. And she coins this phrase, mystery and manners. Mystery being spiritual reality and manners being natural fact or the physical world. And she says that being a Catholic writer means recognizing that spiritual and physical reality are not compartmentalized. They are forces that make up one truth in one universe, and they're actively engaging with one another on a daily basis. And this is something that modernists, and sadly, according to her, most Protestants have lost sight of. They tend to separate mystery and manners and believe that the spiritual can't be perceived through the senses, or that the natural world is irrelevant to this spiritual realm. In fact, O'Connor says that the biggest step to set off the decline in religion was when Protestants stopped believing in the true presence of the Eucharist. Because when that happened, it was almost like there was this wall built between the spiritual and the natural world. And, a couple steps down the road, suddenly you can't really have a concrete relationship with God. And He can't really have an active presence in your physical life. Because the spiritual has been marginalized and made into an abstraction. And she calls this the vaporization of religion.
Vaporization?
Vaporization.
Yeah, it destroys the idea of the incarnation, too.
Right.
You separate those two
Right.
things out. Absolutely like that.
Yeah. There's a lot of...
Right, if you can't believe in that, then you can't really...
Yeah.
It's just a matter of time before you can't believe in the incarnation.
Right, exactly. There's a phrase that a lot of analyzers of O'Connor use where they talk about O'Connor and incarnational art. This idea of art that portrays, spiritual and physical as sort of one interaction.
There's a priest who writes about this, I was telling you,
Mm-hmm.
and he calls the division between the natural and the supernatural, the natural and the spiritual, calls it the two-story universe. He says that moderns, including religious people, tend to live in what they conceptualize as a two-story universe, where we're down on the first story, which is the natural, physical realm, and then God and the angels and spirits are sort of upstairs in the second story, when in fact it's a one-story universe, as she says. They make up one universe.
Upstairs, downstairs?
God.
Make a BBC show out of it.
Yeah, sounds like Downton Abbey.
You know a priest? The priest's name?
Father Stephen Freeman. It's actually Eastern Orthodox. He's not Catholic, but
Okay.
it was an interesting way of describing it, I thought.
So in regards to all this, O'Connor says that Catholic writers are called to try to preserve a sacramental view of the universe in their writing. The belief that the spiritual can be contained or incarnated or known within physical experience. And again, this kind of goes back to what I was talking about earlier, the writer's call to be an observer and to see everything and portray the world honestly, the spiritual and the natural world together. And she says, "The chief difference between the novelist who is an Orthodox Christian and the novelist who is merely a naturalist is that the Christian novelist lives in a larger universe. He believes that the natural world contains the supernatural. And this doesn't mean that his obligation to portray the natural is less. It means it is greater." So now that we've seen O'Connor's philosophy as a writer, I'm going to take a look at her own fiction work and how she applies this philosophy in her work. And while the plots in O'Connor's stories aren't explicitly about religious topics, for the most part, under the surface, her work contains Catholic symbolism and addresses various Catholic issues and themes. And her three most common themes, from what I gather, are the grotesque, redemption, and of course mystery manners, or what I like to call physical meets spiritual. And of course there's some overlap between all of these, as we will see.
That's cheerful.
What's the artist's name?
Bosch.
Bosch, yes. Her name was Bosch. So, yes, the more I look at it, the more it's disturbing.
Remind me not to invite those to our next meeting. Oh,
I like the guy with the pierced chin. Like,
It's our group right there.
So, if you're all wondering what the grotesque is, aside from this picture, the grotesque is a literary term that refers to a style of writing found in the majority of Southern Gothic literature, but also in other literature. And in general, it means an atmosphere that is kind of disturbing, distorted, or bizarre. But I looked up the official definition, which says that the grotesque is meant to invoke a mixture of feelings of uncomfortable bizarreness and sympathetic pity, often with the use of dark humor or irony.
Again, Tim Burton.
True.
So, in Southern Gothic literature, the grotesque may appear as sort of unsettling, violent circumstances, like just taking examples from O'Connor, being mauled to death by a bull or physically beaten by your grandchildren. But
Lovely themes.
what's more interesting, I think, and what I think is more common in O'Connor stories, at least the ones that I've read, is when the grotesque appears in the form of disturbing, deformed characters. And these characters can either be mentally and morally deformed, like, a murderer or a maniac, or they can be physically deformed. O'Connor's stories have a lot of freakish characters that are like missing limbs or, something like that. I think there's one character that's actually a hermaphrodite or something. Very weird, bizarre stuff. And as far as Catholicism goes, or Christianity, writers like O'Connor frequently use the grotesque to symbolize evil or sin in their work. So, why does O'Connor use the grotesque? First and foremost, she uses it to shock her readers and to make them disturbed by evil. She believes that the problem with the modern culture is that it's become indifferent to sin. So it either ignores it or it just denies its existence. Like, I forget what quote we had tonight, but I thought there was a quote about that. And therefore it's the Catholic author's duty to show how horrific sin is and to force the audience to be uncomfortable with it through their grotesque art. And this is, forgive the English major moment, but there's a 20th century Russian literary critic by the name of Viktor Shklovsky. I'll never be able to pronounce that name. My teacher said that if you're not spitting, you're not pronouncing it right.
You got me right in the eye.
Shklovsky. And Shklovsky talks about something similar called defamiliarization. And he says that when a physical experience becomes habitualized, in other words, we experience it over and over and over again, we eventually become numb to it, and it kind of loses its original effect. Therefore, the purpose of art, in Shklovsky's opinion, is to defamiliarize the world. In other words, to depict it as unfamiliar and new, so that it can have a powerful effect on us again, because it's like we're experiencing it for the first time. And this is exactly what O'Connor's trying to do in her fiction. She's trying to break down that normalization of evil in modern society and to make us experience it as an aberration. She says that the Christian writer will often see distortions of morality that are repulsive to him in modern culture. And his job then is to make these appear as distortions to an audience which is used to seeing them as natural.
You know the quote by Chesterton about, what is it, about waking ourselves up with nightmares?
Yep.
Yeah, something to the effect of that the society that we live in is living a dream world, and we're trying to wake ourselves up with nightmares. But,
Yeah. I mean, that seems to be fitting into what she goes with. So essentially, this idea of grotesque, or defamiliarization and such, it boils down to O'Connor using the grotesque to identify sin as sin, and to eliminate the idea of gray areas or fuzzy morality. And there are a couple of different O'Connor stories where a protagonist will meet a grotesque character, like a psychopath or a murderer. And the protagonist will often try to make some excuse for their grotesqueness, like, oh, he's just a victim, or oh, he can be reasoned with, or oh, he can't help it,
he's just a victim of society.
Yeah, exactly.
Society treated him wrong. That's why he acts the way he does.
Exactly. There's actually a story I'll be talking about later that that's exactly what happens. And typically, this type of thinking ends very badly for the protagonist.
Gee, I wonder why.
When they finally discover that these people are just downright evil for the sake of being evil.
Who'd have thought?
And they can't be compromised with. So even though like murderers and psychopaths are like extreme cases of sin, they nevertheless force the reader to realize, like, oh my God, this sin thing exists. Maybe I should watch out. Maybe some of it exists in me. And O'Connor says that the grotesque is not simply showing us what we are, but what we have been and what we could become. Furthermore, depicting the grotesque in the form of individual characters as opposed to like an environment or a circumstance makes the evil more real and more physical in her art. Therefore, it becomes a concrete threat as opposed to just an idea or an abstraction. And this is a common thread among Southern Gothics that I, as an English major, found fascinating when contrasted with New England writers of the time. From what I've read of them, the conflicts or the evil in New England fiction of the 20th century tended to be more abstract ideas. Something tyrannical and impersonal, something tyrannical but impersonal, like white supremacy or social injustice, sort of abstract, broader ideas like that.
The Yankee mind doesn't know shit about
Exactly.
That's what we were all thinking.
But in O'Connor's fiction and in Southern Gothic fiction, it's almost like the devil acts as a character through these grotesque characters. Therefore, he's no longer what O'Connor calls a raging
Yeah, we're all watching you.
Stop stealing the show,
Carry on.
Therefore, it's no longer a generalized evil, but sort of evil with a face. an evil with a personal vendetta against you, such as for using a blowtorch in a carriage house.
So, in other words, like, the devil is not just an abstract concept,
No,
like, just a general evil in the world. He's someone who's
Character, like in The Exorcist.
right. He's somebody that hates you and wants to take you down, basically. You know. So you
Anybody
can't
see the Judge Scalia talking about the devil?
No.
Did anybody see that?
Anybody see him talk about anything?
Well, I read about it.
Yeah, you too.
I mean, I didn't see it, but I read about it, and it was pretty fascinating. And like people were scoffing, you know, here's this highly educated, brilliant man, you know, even though we disagree with his politics, he's highly educated. He's talking about the devil. And he said, "What are you talking about? Jesus Christ believed in the devil." You know, of course I believe in the devil. It was like, you know,
Yeah.
yeah, you know, I'm a Christian. I believe in the devil.
Two different moral universes.
I was about Father Dan McEllerin.
Who's that?
He was a priest down at St. Martha's, and he was blessing holy water. And I still said an exorcism prayer over the holy water when he blessed it. And as he sang the prayer, he stopped with, "I just want you all to know, I believe in the devil. I'm old-fashioned that way."
Yeah, exactly. So I want to ask you, in her writing, is her purpose to make you abhor evil?
Yeah.
It is. Okay, so
Yeah.
a lot of writers create a fascination for evil.
Right. And
Like
that's
Dracula, things of that
yeah.
nature, which has an incredibly huge religious connotation to it.
Mm-hmm.
If anybody ever read the book, not the movies, you know.
yeah.
I'm just curious.
Yeah, I mean, like, I think that you see, you know, like you said, like, a lot of literature that, like, will have, like, you know, kind of symbols of evil in it, but it's more sort of like the fascination of it.
Mhm.
Whereas what makes her writing different is that she tries to make it as grotesque and as disgusting and as uncomfortable as possible. Because she doesn't want you to be in love with it. She wants it to be disturbing.
Okay.
You know, so that's kind of her point, is to make sin not fascinating, but to make it, oh my god, this is disgusting. Why is this, you know, why would I ever be fascinated by this? That's a good question. So now I'm going to go into one example of a grotesque character.
Is that Jerry Garcia? What is it?
Well, I was thinking, that kind of looks like you tonight. Hawaiian shirt. Does that have
Have you ever
glasses?
done anything?
I was trying to figure it all out.
Yeah, that is you, Steve. You're saying buy my CDs or not?
Whatever.
And so this character, this interesting looking guy here, is from her story that we heard the beginning of earlier, which is "A Good Man is Hard to Find." And in this story, basically the premise is that there's a family on their way to vacation when their car breaks down. And they meet this escaped murderous criminal named the Misfit, this guy, who then proceeds to shoot the family members one by one. So it's a very horrible story.
Sounds like a very typical story.
And what's interesting about the Misfit is that obviously he's a despicable character because he's, you know, a cold-blooded murderer. But at the same time, when you read the story and like you read the conversations he has with other people in it, he's also very sort of polite and charming, and he actually manages to carry on an intelligent conversation with the grandmother character, who's the protagonist. You know, even as his men are off, you know, killing her family in the woods, and the grandmother tries to use like his sort of, you know, southern charm, as a, you know, because she's a southern lady too, as a way to reason with the Misfit. You know, and she says, "You wouldn't shoot a lady, would you? I know you're a good man at heart." You know, things like this she keeps repeating. And his response is, "No, ma'am, I ain't a good man." You know, and later on he elaborates in one of their sort of esoteric discussions. "If Jesus didn't raise the dead, it's nothing for you to do but enjoy the few minutes you've got left by the best way you can. By killing someone, or burning down his house, or doing some other meanness to him. No pleasure but meanness. So we see that he's very self-aware of his sinfulness, and he knows that what he's doing is wrong, and he does it anyway. And it's through that grotesque nature that O'Connor shows us that sin isn't victimhood or confusion. It's a conscious choice, and that's what makes it so evil and so threatening.
It's kind of like mental illness, unless you've actually experienced people with mental illness, it's easy to have this stereotype of someone who's mentally ill. People think, they can't be intelligent and mentally ill.
Yeah.
Or they can't be well-mannered and mentally ill.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? And it's the same thing with people who are leading sinful lives. Well, he's such a nice person. Well, that's just one aspect of his personality that you happen to be seeing.
Right. Right. And that's something that I think she addresses a lot in a lot of her characters, is this idea of people can be perfectly polite and perfectly nice.
Right.
That doesn't make them good people.
Not to bring up Hitler, but people who knew him personally said he was charming and a good friend.
Well, if you're going to stretch that, let's say, is there any good people on your sorry, that was
Good shot. Oh man. And so moving on to something that's a little more cheerful, but not so cheerful in her stories, is another sort of enormous Catholic theme in O'Connor's fiction, which is the idea of redemption. And at the end of her stories, we do often see the beginnings of a transformation or conversion, even if it's not necessarily like a religious conversion, but like a change of heart of sorts in her protagonists. But unlike a lot of other Christian fiction, this transformation is almost never happy or pleasant. Usually it's the result of some kind of horrible event, like seeing your family murdered or losing your home to a fire.
Which makes sense. Our redemption was not pleasant at all.
Yeah, and it's because she's trying to portray that redemption.
Freaking brutal.
Redemption, yeah, like you said, is not pleasant. It's uncomfortable. It hurts.
Is it St. Paul who says, "I'm working out my salvation in fear and trembling"?
Yeah.
Man, I was trying to think of that quote the other day, and it kept escaping me. And it's like, it should be so right here in my head. Thank you.
So yeah, redemption hurts. It's painful because real conversion means that all of a sudden all your preconceptions about the world are just shattered. In her stories, O'Connor tends to have a lot of morally self-righteous protagonists who think that they're, better than everybody else, or they're the only ones who really know how the world works. And their redemption occurs usually when they have some kind of encounter with the grotesque. And in the case when the grotesque is another character, what happens is that meeting that person and seeing sin in that person at its most extreme causes the protagonist to suddenly recognize bits of that sin in himself. So redemption in her stories is this humbling moment of, oh my God, I'm more flawed than I think I am. So in general, what we see in those instances echoes our earlier discussion of mystery and manners. The spiritual meets physical. Because in her stories, redemption happens when characters encounter, physical characters encounter the spiritual within a physical experience, usually spiritual evil in the form of the grotesque.
Go ahead.
No, I just finished reading, I don't know if you read it, The Artificial Nigger.
I haven't gotten to that yet, but
I found out in the end that the grandfather's taking the son back to his roots. He's born out of wedlock, but the grandfather I won't tell you the whole thing, but he disowns, he says, I don't know you, sort of like Peter and Jesus.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know you. And then the kid is mortified, and then in the end, it even took me by surprise that the grandson forgives him, and he has such a hard time forgiving himself. It's very uncomfortable from it. I can see that right there.
Yeah.
I was going to say about the whole thing about redemption being uncomfortable and painful. Again, this is, you see the Protestant notion of being born again or saved or whatever.
Once saved, always
It's
saved.
seen as this big, happy, joyful event. When in fact, sin is kind of like if you're addicted to heroin. Heroin must feel awfully good.
Otherwise, people wouldn't do it.
Good for people to be so horribly addicted to.
Yeah.
And to give it up really is a horrible, painful thing. I remember once reading about Miles Davis, who was addicted to heroin and what he went through to get off of it. And it's hard and it's awful to give up sin. And it's like, okay, I got to stop screwing around. I got to pick up a cross for the rest of my life.
Right.
That's what redemption is like.
Right.
The whole Protestant televangelist thing paints a picture of this as a happy occurrence. It's a very tough thing that you're doing.
Well, religious conversion, you also have to deal with the media demonizing you for the rest of your life.
I remember a long time ago, Covenant Church, there was a guy who was very enthusiastic about handing out pamphlets, and I remember glancing at the pamphlet one day, and it had big bold letters on it that said, "Salvation is easy." Follow these 3 steps and you're all set.
Step-by-step guide.
Admit that you have a problem.
You follow them?
That's only the first step.
Later on, the guy dumped his middle-aged wife for a younger model.
That was easy.
So there were a lot of protagonists that I could have used, but I decided to go with one of my favorite stories, who undergoes this type of redemption. And the name of the story is the Partridge Festival. And at the start of the story, it takes place in this sort of like small southern town. There had recently been a murder where this man named Singleton walked into a courthouse and shot 6 people after he had been publicly ridiculed by some townspeople. And the main character is this young man named Calhoun. And Calhoun is this intellectual person, but rather arrogant person too, who he sees Singleton as a victim, who is kind of merely reacting against the tyrannical community. It was like, oh, the community drove him insane. That's why he did this. Shame on the community, kind of thing. And Calhoun views himself as the only reasonable one, in this town of simple-minded people who truly understands, this murderer. What?
What are we missing?
I'm comparing myself to Singleton and Ben to Calhoun.
Oh man.
Who have you murdered today?
I know, I was going to say.
Close.
What are you hiding?
Hello, guys.
So what's interesting about Calhoun is that, in his narration, he keeps recalling, a picture in the newspaper that he saw of Singleton's face. And he keeps telling himself, oh, he looks just like me. Maybe, that's some kind of sign that we share something internally, that we think alike. And he likes to think that he and Singleton are very like-minded people and the only reasonable people in this, crazy small town. And then Calhoun goes to visit Singleton in prison. And he's shocked to discover that the man is absolutely nothing more than a perverted, psychopathic lunatic. And the story ends with, with Calhoun running out of the prison in absolute terror. And at the ending scene of the story, Calhoun sees a reflection of his face in a mirror. And it says, he saw at once the likeness to Singleton, and he flinched. So suddenly in that moment, Calhoun experiences a redemption because he finally recognizes that what he shares with this character is his grotesqueness, his sinfulness, and now he can be repulsed by that. And the last story that I'm going to talk about is to sort of summarize all of O'Connor's philosophy, is my all-time favorite story by O'Connor, which I very bravely called the best O'Connor story ever.
I'm sure that was the subtitle that
I'm sure some people might disagree with me, but in my opinion, it's one of her best stories because I think it beautifully summarizes her philosophy and uses a lot of symbolism that's more recognizably Catholic as opposed to just Christian. And redemption does occur in the story, but unlike her other works, the redemptive moment is an encounter with spiritual good incarnate as opposed to evil or the grotesque. So in other words, instead of meeting, the devil, the main character meets God through a physical experience. And this is consistent with O'Connor's idea of the Catholic sacramental experience, coming to know God in the physical realm. And summary of Parker's Back, for those of you who haven't read it. The main character is a man named Obadiah Parker. And he's kind of this wayward man who kind of lives a loose life of drinking and brawling, gambling, smoking, kind of like you guys.
I take it back. This
The only thing that he tops you guys on is that his entire body is covered. Entire body.
I'm young yet. I'm young. Working on it.
Except for his back. And in the story, Parker marries this, decent Christian girl who, looks down on his way of living, of course, as, oh, you're a sinner, you're going to go to hell, and she's always criticizing and complaining, And during a moment of crisis, Parker decides that he's, going to get a picture of Christ's face tattooed to his back because, maybe this will finally gain this silly woman's approval. So he gets this tattoo, and something happens to him. Suddenly his old way of life is ruined because he can't go, to his old hangouts at bars because everyone makes fun of him because he has, Jesus' face on his back, And the embarrassment of having this tattoo makes him start to question his life. And it's that we start to see his mental conversion. So in this way, the tattoo of Christ symbolizes Parker's encounter with God in a physical experience. Because suddenly the spiritual becomes painfully real, because its image is literally engraved into his back.
You say this one isn't about the grotesque, but this is at a time that people didn't have tattoos all over their body like they do today. So
True.
probably in her time, the idea that someone would have this huge picture of Jesus on their back was a kind of grotesque.
I hadn't thought about that. That's an interesting point.
I hadn't thought about that either. But
I see Puerto Ricans with tattoos like that all the time.
Oh, yeah, right now.
Yeah, they have Mary on their arm or something.
Yeah.
Yeah, probably viewed as a desecration.
Right.
Well, I was just wondering why the tattoo artist had this whole book of just stuff in his, where did I leave off?
His conversion.
Yeah, so, as I was saying, it's only by experiencing God physically in this way that he can actually begin his transformation. And white book. I'd like to read my favorite scene from this, which is the final scene, which is when Parker comes home after he's kind of, thought about his life. And this is, of course, after he has gotten his tattoo. And he comes home to his wife, and they get into an argument about something.
And she's Protestant, right?
And she's Protestant. That's a key point. Not that he's Catholic or anything, but that's just something to keep in mind. "Shut your mouth," he said quietly. "Look at this, and then I don't want to hear no more out of you." He removed the shirt and turned his back to her. "Another picture," Sarah Ruth growled. "I might have known you was off after putting some more trash on yourself." Parker's knees went hollow under him. He wheeled around and cried, "Look at it. Don't just say that. Look at it." "I done look," she said. "Don't you know who it is?" he cried in anguish. "No. Who is it?" Sarah Ruth cried. "It ain't anybody I know." "It's him," Parker said. "Him who?" "God," Parker cried. "God? God don't look like that." "What do you know how he looks?" Parker moaned. "You ain't seen him." "He don't look," Sarah Ruth said. "He's a spirit. No man shall see his face." "Ah, listen," Parker groaned. "This is just a picture of him." "Idolatry," Sarah Ruth screamed. "Idolatry! Inflaming yourself with idols under every green tree. I can put up with lies and vanity, but I don't want no idolater in this house." And she grabbed up the broom and began to thrash him across the shoulders with it. Parker was too stunned to resist. He sat there and let her beat him until she had nearly knocked him senseless, and large welts had formed on the face of the tattooed Christ. Then he staggered up and made for the door. She stamped the broom 2 or 3 times on the floor and went to the window and shook it out to get the taint of him off it. Still gripping it, she looked towards the pecan tree, and her eyes hardened still more. There he was, who called himself Obadiah Elihu, leaning against the tree, crying like a baby. And I love that ending. As I said, that's my favorite story because I think it's very fascinating knowing that O'Connor wrote so many stories about Protestants, and this was sort of her, the idolatry moment, in criticizing her for that. It was sort of her one jab at Protestantism and one moment of hurrah Catholicism in her work. Because it's a criticism on her part. Because she's saying that the wife can't see Parker's redemption due to lacking that sacramental belief that God can be known through a physical experience. Brown book. And to wrap this up, I thought that I would let Flannery have the last word with a good quote. "The novelist and the believer, when they are not the same man, yet have many traits in common. A distrust of the abstract, a respect for boundaries, a desire to penetrate the surface of reality, and to find in each thing the spirit which makes it itself and holds the world together. But I don't believe that we shall have great religious fiction until we can have again that happy combination of believing artist and believing society. Until that time, the novelist will have to do the best he can with the world he has. He may find in the end that instead of reflecting the image at the heart of things, he has only reflected our broken condition and, through it, the face of the devil we are possessed by. This is a modest achievement, but perhaps a necessary one." Thank you. And if you're wondering what that picture is, there's actually a new stamp out of Flannery OConnor. So after
just reading that on the Wikipedia page.
Yeah, so after you pick up her books, you can pick up one of those too.
And ship it to your friend.